As artificial intelligence continues to reshape societies and economies around the world, the conversation around its governance has become increasingly urgent and multifaceted. In my interview with Ayatollah Alayode, a researcher at the Global Center on AI Governance, he digs into Africa's emerging role in shaping global AI governance and how countries like Nigeria and South Africa are ensuring their unique priorities are reflected in the global AI agenda. Here's more. As a researcher at the Global Center on AI Governance, Ayatollah, what is Africa's role in shaping AI governance? Because on the sidelines of the last UN summit, it was declared that Africa is increasingly neither part of the global north or the global south. It is the emerging global center. So what's Africa's participation like?
Yeah, excellent. No, thanks for that. And I like that you alluded to the idea that Africa is increasingly neither sort of like a global south, at least monolithically, nor a global north. It's sort of a global center where you have sort of a mix of ideas emerging from it. But I think there's a lot we bring to the table in terms of unique perspectives, right, that are currently unaccounted for in global governance debates. The continent as a whole represents sort of a unique voice in multilateral reform, right? And this is very important for global cooperation in AI governance. So at the moment, you find this sort of architecture where countries in the global north tend to, based on the history of resources and power and all of those things, tend to dominate global governance debate. This is not just AI; it's in everything, whether it's climate change or migration or things like that. But increasingly, we're seeing powerful African countries like South Africa and a host of others, even Nigeria, where I'm from, advocating for a reform in the current multilateral architecture. And I think this is something that can also apply to artificial intelligence. We need to start to rethink our participation models, right? Like how do countries in the north and south work together, but also how do we get African leaders, African policymakers in the room where these decisions are being made. So that's another thing we could contribute to. But I also think, even though there's the sort of like subtle agreement that Africa is neither north or south, but we represent a sort of force in the majority world. And I think it's an opportunity to lead this kind of work, not just for the African continent, but for several other countries in the global south. So there's a huge opportunity ahead of us to define the future of AI, not just for the continent, but for the world. One that is equitable, one that's accessible, one that's built on the ethics of justice and responsibility.
All right, fantastic, Ayatollah. But just before we get into the linguistic gap conversation, just to touch a bit on what you said about South Africa, Nigeria, doing their bit to ensure that they contribute to the global AI conversation, because we do know that this year, Nigeria released her own national AI strategy so that our priorities are reflected. So let's talk about those priorities a little more now. How can we ensure that Africa's unique context is captured in global AI governance?
I think there are two ways to these things. One is sort of the idea of sort of advocating for inclusion in global governance or global AI governance debate. The other one is this sort of your own active participation or active push as a continent. I think I like to start from that, something that sort of takes account of Africa's agency. Earlier this year, I worked together with a host of others and at the Global Center on AI Governance on African Union Continental AI Strategy, right? And that was sort of a unique opportunity for us as Africans to advance on our own ideas. And one of the things we pushed for in the strategy was a new concept of AI risk, which is what we call risks to African values and systems, what we call sort of subversion of indigenous knowledge, right? So the increase in digitalization, of course, it's an advantage to want to get as much data as possible to increase the accuracy and competence of these AI models. At the same time, we are pushing for a sort of technological revolution that doesn't take into account local knowledge, local context, or that slowly erases some sort of subtle or unspoken cultural practices, right? And I think this is something that no one will take seriously if you don't come together as a continent to advance or push for that idea. So I think before we talk about inclusion, we need to also talk about active participation, sort of taking your own destiny into your hands. And I must commend like the African Union and also Aldanepad and a host of other regional organizations that are working on these things. In terms of active inclusion, I think this is something that's certainly very important. Countries within the African Union, countries within the African continent need to also kind of go all out, in forming these sort of partnerships, right? So Nigeria, for example, is a partner to the Bletchley Declaration that was the UK Responsible AI Summit that happened last year. I think it's also a signatory to the Hiroshima Agreement, which includes Japan and a host of other countries working on safety of generative AI. So on one hand, we need to push for, inclusion. On the other hand, we need to be very active in kind of defining this AI feature for ourselves.
Well, you're definitely right. We need collaboration, we need partnerships, because when it comes to something as huge as this, we cannot afford to work in silos. But when it comes to AI development and the responsible use of, I'm going to say, localized AI solutions, because we're bringing this down to Africa's context, how can we better take advantage of our youth? Because almost everyone agrees that there's a massive amount of talent coming out of Africa. How can we take advantage of that to drive digital growth?
Okay, there's a lot of things we need to do. I think I'll just come back to these fundamentals. When the Nigerian government released its national AI strategy, which I think is a good one. It's definitely a progress in the right direction. People responded in a way that I thought was interesting. And one of the arguments that came out of that response was that you cannot build AI on top of nothing, right? You need to be working on your fundamental infrastructure, right? Electricity, internet, data infrastructure, which Nigeria is seriously lagging behind in, right? So to take advantage or to harness the power of, artificial intelligence, we need to start from this sort of, basic infrastructure. For example, internet penetration in Nigeria is less than 50% of the entire population. So we need to, be expanding broadband access. And there's a lot of policy framework actually that's, being formed to create an enabling environment for this, but we need more investment in this direction. So infrastructure investment is one thing we need to be doing, and within that also, maybe I could cover this a little bit. We need to be investing in data centers, compute power. Basically, you cannot be an AI leader without having enough compute investment. The second thing is, and this is a bit of a tricky one, is linguistic representation. I have kind of like different idea around this. There are over 10,000 languages in the world, right? And only about 10 of them or so dominate the internet. And in fact, when you look at African languages representation, is actually less than 2% on the internet. It's kind of like a tricky debate where you're thinking, well, this is a private sector remit, right? How much should governments really do? But looking at where we are at the moment, we need some sort of government support in this sense, and priorities are very, very important. But we also need investment in skills and talent, right? We've made some progress, at least in the last couple of years. If you look at the post 2010 sort of tech revolution in Nigeria, where you have a lot of young people that are getting into data science, machine learning, and a lot of other digital skills. But we need to kind of move up the chain a little bit. And this is what I mean. We need to be investing in skills that make our young people competitive globally, right? So when it comes to investment in skills and talents, we need a mix of both. We need governments to be investing in skills and talent, traditional, digital skills, or even those that are very specific to AI, like, prompt engineering, data labeling, machine learning, data science, and all of that. But at the same time, we need to have policy guardrails in place that prevent, regulatory arbitrage or companies taking advantage of loopholes. For example, the fair wage argument, right? If you are a Nigerian data scientist, you should, if not exactly as your US counterpart, but you should be earning something that's fairly comparable to them. And I think we need our government to step in this.
We'll be wrapping up in a bit, but just to say that I totally agree with you. I think there there are so many important areas we need to definitely pay attention to before AI can fully work here. And like you said, policies, investment, data infrastructure, internet penetration, and all of that. And I know that you've touched a little bit on this, but I'm going to take us back a bit to the linguistic gap, because despite the significant strides AI has made in different sectors, be it healthcare, finance, or even security, there's still a linguistic divide, especially when it comes to generative AI. So if we're talking about inclusivity, why do many AI tools struggle to work effectively in less widely spoken languages or dialects? And I can give you context, right? Because I'm producing a program on AI, and we're trying to make use of AI tools to make it much more relatable to the Nigerian audience. And when we try to make use of the Nigerian or African English style, there are limitations in terms of the manner avatars can speak, which doesn't apply to the UK or US English style. So what are your thoughts on this?
So the way AI systems work is kind of simple. It's just computers generally. It's garbage in, garbage out. So you have a machine learning framework, but you also have your inputs, which is basically the data, right? And that gives you your model. So you can guess why they don't work so well with African languages. It's just the same argument I made. There's not enough representation of African languages on the internet for the data to even be trained on it, right? And this is not just about African languages, right? It's also about many local languages that are not well documented or well digitized in the world. So you can expect the models to underperform when it comes to this. But it's not also just about language. It's also about understanding the context, right? So let's say you even do an excellent job in, translating these languages. I can give you an example. There's an interesting project that's been done in a West African country that attempts to, so you have this sort of revolution that's going on in that part of the world where governments are increasingly shifting from, the dominant colonial language of French to making their local language the, lingua franca. And in this country, you had a team of, very brilliant ML engineers who came together to say, look, this is a chicken and egg problem. You want to develop curriculum in your local language, right? You want, using AI as it were. But you can't do that if you do not have enough of that language or text, a corpus of that language represented online, right? But for that to happen as well, you need, AI tools, right? So to do that, it was sort of like you needed to still start from English, right? And so you generate all this content in English and then use some third-party application and connect it to whatever AI tool or AI model you're using, and then you translate it into that local language, right? In that process, even though you have some sort of corpus already, for example, Google Translate, there's an excellent work being done on Yoruba language and on Google Translate, or Hausa, or several other Nigerian languages, for example. But the context is missing, right? When you do these translations, right? And that's very important. So to kind of get, to bypass this linguistic divide, we need to be doing two things. We need to invest more in local data collection. But like I said, we also need to put guardrails in place. So it's kind of like a tricky balance, because for AI models to work effectively, right, they need large troves of data. At the same time, it kind of going on a mindless journey of data collection has so many risks, right? Data privacy risks, especially, and also cyber security risks. So we need to kind of do this in a very balanced way. But the second thing as well is to engage local engineers, linguists, and everyone in that sort of, ecosystem. It's not enough to just say, okay, we have a bunch of guys who've done excellent work in doing the translations or, doing the NLP frameworks in local languages, but you also need to employ or engage people who understand local context. And this is why I keep arguing that, to have a robust AI ecosystem, you just don't need a scientist alone. You need people from, the arts and humanities, because this is about social technical context, right? So you need to be engaging those kind of people. And I think that's sort of the way forward.
Okay, Ayatollah, I think for every response you give, I can say I totally agree with you. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, Ayatollah Alayande, researcher at the Global Center on AI Governance. Thank you so much for sharing your time and insights with us on Tech Trends.
Thank you, Alayande.